Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name, in case you don't know it, is Tom Wilcox. I'm an adult services librarian here at the Leesburg Public Library here in Leesburg, Florida. And what I'm going to do is this program is going to recreate the Ellis Island experience for many Americans' ancestors. And I chose Ellis because of the name recognition. This procedure happened basically in every single port an immigrant came into, but Ellis Island got the most. And so they seemed like a good place to start. So anyway, basically, an estimated 40% of the current American population can claim ancestry from at least one person who passed through Ellis Island. And I know that's true for me because my great-grandmother, Agnes Casey, went through there in 1901. My great-grandfather, whom she married in this country, actually came here much earlier in 1887. And it was sort of interesting because he was processed through Castle Garden in New York, which was actually run by New York City and New York State. And so, it's funny why I'm doing this is that a lot of people sort of remember the stories handed down of this being a warm and fuzzy experience entering a new country, and basically it wasn't, because that's not what Ellis Island was trying to do. So let's go on and I'll show you exactly how intense this process could be at times. Hey, well, basically before 1890, the U.S. didn't really much care about what kind of people were coming into the country because we literally had this insane need for labor. And this is a picture of a typical 19th century project of the Pennsylvania canals that linked New York City with the western coal fields, which was absolutely vital. The whole nation, everything got powered on coal. And no more now, but it was very much so then. And so by 1891, as more and more native-born Americans were born, or naturalized Americans were in this country, there was less need for foreign labor. So starting around 1890, the government took over sole control, the federal government, of immigration, because like I said before, Castle Garden was actually run as a state and a city operation. So anyway, this is what they did. And now, there was a sort of painful reality to this, is that, Americans at that time, they made no secret that they preferred Northern over Eastern and Southern European immigrants. And even the so-called formerly despised Irish, and they were quite despised in the middle 19th century. I've seen cartoons of, like, one I saw was this Noah's Ark type thing coming through the bounding waves to America, and on top it had a high structure that said Galway poorhouse. I mean, that's how people once felt about the Irish in this country. But anyway, immigrants were sort of forewarned about all the things that they would have to go through when they came here. And so, and the shipping companies took this so seriously in Europe that in some of the ports, I believe one of them in Hamburg, which was a major immigrant port in Germany, there's a museum now that was called the Immigrant Village. And what they did, they literally took these people off the trains and housed them and fed them and instructed them what to do when they got here in order to make sure that they didn't come back. So it was really sort of an interesting thing that they were doing. Now, this is one of the very early passenger records that a lot of people had. I mean, there was, of course, the original ticket information, the ship's manifest, but other places like Liverpool actually had lists of people who were leaving the UK but not coming back. And it's a little hard to see, but right here, number 65 is my great grandmother, Agnes Casey. It's not very clear because it was written in pencil, which they shouldn't have done, but that's what they did. And there was, and so that's the typical kind of record that they often would have. And this is a typical immigrant ship. And the immigration traffic to America was so competitive, it was literally a cash cow. All the lines vied with each other in the number of immigrant passengers they carried and how fast they could cross the Atlantic. Um, just to give you an idea, my great grandmother Agnes traveled on the White Star Liner Oceanic. And just to show you how profitable this was, um, the average cost of a ticket was only about $30, which doesn't sound much to us, but larger ships could hold from 1,500 to 2,000 immigrants. And they could really, one ship could net a profit of $45,000 to $60,000 a trip. And it only cost 60 cents a day to feed the immigrants en route. But just think of the scale we're talking about, because a typical Cunard ship could steam at about 19 knots. On average, it took 6 or 7 days, and they needed 3,432 tons of coal. So you can see why they were always trying to actually, measure cost and reduce costs as much as possible, because it was really that lucrative a market. And they were very aggressive about it. If you see this line, the Guyan line, they were a U.S. company. They sailed from Pier 38 in New York, which was King Street, for Queenstown and Liverpool. And these are all their ships. And so they basically had to turn around a ship a week. One ship a week would be coming between Europe and America. And now with Agnes, she spent 9 days on the Atlantic. So that was a little longer than usual, but she made it. Now getting here, this is sort of interesting. Third or steerage accommodations, they varied quite widely between different lines. And in most cases, quarters were shared and passengers were mostly grouped by family or single by gender. And actually, Walter Lord pointed out on his book, A Night to Remember, about the Titanic. He said that was absolute pandemonium because the White Star Line primly quartered all the men in the bow and all the women in the aft. So all the boys were literally running aft to try and join the girls to get them to the boats. So, but actually, some lines like White Star, people thought the steerage accommodations were so good that they compared to second class on some other lines. Now, a steerage fare, $56 in 1903 would be over $1,500 today. So, when you don't think it costs that much, just think and adjusted for inflation, what it would be. Imagine trying to get a whole family. I mean, people literally sold every stick of furniture, every article of clothing they couldn't pack. They begged, borrowed, and hopefully not, but probably some stole the money to get here. Because, I mean, we had this such golden reputation. People just had to get here. And now the actual inspections actually started aboard ship, because there would be like anywhere from 6 to 10 ships waiting in the lower New York harbor. And they would send the U.S. Public Health Service doctors would check every passenger, any sort of diseases, and they begin the process of interrogating the immigrants. And now what they would do is that the immigrants would be ferried out to barges that would take them to Ellis Island. The first and second class passengers were allowed to stay on the ship, and that would go to the company's docks on the Hudson River, because there was the theory then that if you could afford first or second cabin, you could probably not ever possibly be that sick that you would have to be detained on Ellis Island and with the rest of them. So that's anyway, some of these barges held as many as 600 people, and they had very few toilet facilities, and sometimes they were there for hours, literally hours, until there was room for them on the island. Now, this was one of the most momentous parts of the Ellis Island experience. It sounds like, it doesn't look like much. It's a stairway, but it was a very important stairway. They deliberately constructed the building to make the immigrants go upstairs instead of having a receiving immigration station on the ground floor. Everybody had to go upstairs, and doctors would be watching them. They were watching for anyone with faltering steps, heavy breathing, or someone who looked confused by their surroundings. And it actually was called the 6-second medical exam. And they would look for anything that implied weakness. And this is where they were going to. They were going to the Great Hall. This is how it looked. They had all these steel pens that everybody was herded through. It was a little like the Kansas City stockyards, I imagine. And this is how you would see it today. So it's much nicer, much cleaner looking, and like I said, much more warm and fuzzier than it was then. Alistair Cook, a British reporter who lived in the United States and commented for the BBC on a lot of things. He once asked an immigrant about the procedure at Ellis Island, and the old man screeched. He says procedure? He's screaming. He says pushing, shoving, everybody moving around, people yelling at you. So that gives you an idea what was happening at the time. And now, normally the whole procedure getting you through Ellis Island took about 3 to 5 hours. And but it was not as easy as that, because I mean, some of the steerage conditions were so wretched that people needed immediate medical attention on the island. And we'll cover more about that a little later. I mean, but over the course of its history, 3,500 people died on Ellis Island, and including half of them were 1,400 children. However, 350 babies were born as Americans on the island. And these were the inspectors. These were the people who had literally the power of whether you could stay in America or not. And as you could see, they were quite intimidating in their blue uniforms. And just, think back. I mean, some of our ancestors were lucky enough to know English when they got here, and they sort of had an idea what was going on. But just think of the foreign born. I mean, this could be, very, very frightening. And there were people like Jews from Russia who had reason to fear anyone official or in uniform. And this is what they did inspecting the line. They actually had predetermined codes. And like, for instance, a B would be a back, CT would be trachoma, F plus would be feet, G would be goiter, PG would pregnancy. And so there were all these things and basically you would be watched and you would be marked. And this is how they did it. The marks were applied on your garments with a piece of chalk. And I mean, must have been absolutely terrifying to a lot of people, especially those who didn't understand English. These strange marks were applied on a family member or on yourself. No explanation of what they meant was given. All it was is that it was going to mark you to be taken out for more examination, more interrogation. And it was hardly reassuring. And they actually kept records of these detainees. And And there are a lot of reasons to briefly detain an immigrant, and single women traveling alone, like Agnes, were brought greater scrutiny from officials. And this is actually a list of, they wanted to know, why was she coming to the United States? And her answer was, it says right here, it says, care of Father Henry to be married to Daniel Marr at 500 and a half 6th Avenue, New York. So that was her reason. And of course, Father Henry, I have not, nobody ever spoke of him, but he must have somehow had this sort of informal dating service connecting American Irish men with, Irish women, although they probably knew each other because they went to the same parish, and they were about the same age, and he was like a year older. So chances are they probably knew each other. It was just a matter of just putting them together. Now, here's a very familiar thing that we keep hearing about in the news, unaccompanied minors. And of course, now the issue is on our southern border with Mexico and Central America, but then it was Europe. And they had to do a lot of things for these kids because they didn't specifically believe that these kids would automatically be taken back, but they did have rules by 1907 that they actually had to have some sort of an adult with them, and that was really sort of a problem sometimes. In fact, Annie Moore, the very first immigrant who passed through the old Ellis Island, the one you see now was actually a replacement. The original one was built of wood and corrugated iron, and it burned down. So what you visit now is a replacement. So anyway, this is believed to be Annie with her brothers, and they were unaccompanied minors. And she's an interesting story in itself because nobody knew what happened to her after she left the island. They gave her a gold dollar, and made a big ceremony out of it, and she just sort of disappeared. Now, in the 1980s, they were restoring the Statue of Liberty, and as part of the fundraising, they made a doll, like Franklin Mint kind of thing that you buy on television, and it was supposed to be Annie Moore coming to this country, and they would sell them. And because of that, a family in Iowa claimed that they were the descendants of Annie Moore, and so they provide a lot of publicity and everything. But somewhat later, a very prominent genealogist called Megan Smolniak actually found that they were not descendants of Annie Moore at all. And Annie herself actually never lived more than a mile from where the Ellis Island ferry took her to Battery Park. And she lived her entire life on the Lower East Side, dying in 1924. Now, in the medical exam, they were looking for anything, and this is a direct quote. They were looking for rashes, fever, birth defects, limps, labored breathing, coughing, lice, any sort of contagious eye disease, and feeble-mindedness, which, this was not political correctness. This is how they spoke then. And the nose and throat exam, I mean, anything sneezing, runny nose, anything you distress in swallowing, anything swollen tongue, all of these things had to be examined. And the eye exam was pretty fearsome. On the left, this is what they use. They would lift up your eyelid with a button hook, as you see in the picture here, and to see what you had. And they took it. Trachoma was considered at that time to be a contagious disease, yet not one medical officer, despite constant daily contact, ever came down with it. And actually, these guys got pretty good. Two doctors could do like 1,000 people a day, examined them. In fact, one of them years later, he became an eminent surgeon. He said it was the best training out of medical school he ever had. And of course, they did the heart and lungs as well. And this is how they examined the men. Now, women were a little different. They could lower their garments to above the heart for modesty, and they were examined by nurses. So it was all very proper the way they did it. Okay, well, this is what happened if you failed the health exam. You were actually detained on the island. And it's hard to say. Some immigrants could stay there for days, weeks, sometimes months, even very rarely years. And, they either got well enough to finish the processing and enter the United States, or they had to be returned to their home country. And in case you're wondering, less than 2% people were refused entrance to the United States, something under like 200,000 people. So considering that they were open from 1892 to 1954, so even though it's known as the Isle of Tears, pretty much everyone who got there got off of it in the way they intended. Let's go on to the next slide. Oh, now the mental acuity test was sort of interesting. I actually found this in Smithsonian Magazine, and they were supposed to weed out any persons who were thought on feeble expression. They would put that F on you because, if you were like looking around like, ooh, you definitely got that F. But, and they devised this simple puzzle to test them because they had a real problem. They would go through these extensive interrogations from the inspectors trying to figure out if they really had it there mentally or not. And so the puzzle sort of was a quick way to do it to keep process everybody through. But if you failed, there were no do-overs. So you just have to really think about that. Now, they also had trick questions. And, this is where the immigrant network came in, which still exists today. The people who come before you tell you everything you should do and everything you should say or shouldn't say. And one of the questions was about, did you have a job? Did you have a contracted job in the United States? You could not say yes. If you didn't answer correctly, you could be sent back. And this was due to the 1885 Alien Contract Labor Law, also known as the Foran Act. And it says here that it was an act to prohibit the importation or migration of foreigners and aliens under contract or agreement to perform labor in the United States. And they wanted you to have a job when you got here, because that was the other problem. They didn't want you to go on what they considered public charge, which we consider welfare. And but you were not, even if you actually had a contracted job waiting for you, you were supposed to say no. So the smart immigrant would do that. Now, here's the public charge dilemma. One of the most important things the immigrant had to have on a person was money. And Agnes stated she had $20. And that was an important sum. There were two important things on her record: that she had $20. Her occupation was a servant. And there's a reason for the servant, because women generally didn't pass this test because everyone knew they made far less than men and were more likely to become a public charge, especially if they got pregnant and had a child. So in the different thing that they did was that if you were servant, they gave you much more of a free pass. And there was a reason for that, because their way of thinking was that a young, healthy servant girl would be hired by some, middle-class family, and that her wages would be supplemented by room and board. And so, like I said, if you said you were a servant, you generally got a free go to America pass, but anyone else could be in real trouble there. Now, these are some of the other questions that they have. They want to know the name and address of a relative from your native country, your final destination in America, and Agnes said she was going to Brooklyn, and also who paid for your passage. And she said her cousin paid for it. And so there was a lot of information on these documents. Now, these are two really extremely strange questions. In 1901, Agnes was asked, "Are you a polygamist?" I mean, I'm just making a really good guess here, but the reason is that a few years before, in 1896, Utah was actually admitted as a state to the Union, and one of the things that Congress stipulated was that they had to Mormons had to formally renounce polygamy because that was considered to be, you know, in great disfavor by most American people at the time. And so they seemed very, very concerned about it. I don't know whether they thought Mormons around the world were salting the United States with avowed polygamists or what, but, you know, that's the question. Now, a few years later, her sister Lizzie came over and she was asked, "Are you an anarchist?" And an anarchist is someone who doesn't believe in organized government and believes that people left alone could work out their own arrangements, and they're very anti-authoritarian in any shape or form. And as silly as it may sound, it was a palpable fear because just a few years before, in 1901, Leon Czolgosz, an avowed anarchist, mortally wounded President McKinley in Buffalo. So it it made a lot more sense when you see it in that light. Now, the newspapers, you know, all had this thing. I mean, they were always in the news this whole process. And so, anyway, this is an article from 1893 in Harper's Weekly. Said the Voyager in the steerage finds its course strewn with thick with obstacles. And it says here, furthermore, it said, for him, the new world becomes a mighty interrogation point. Failure to answer properly any one of a score of questions asked him perhaps by half a score of times by as many different men. Failure even to allay suspicion by his manner, though his words are satisfactory, may cost him vexatious delay or the shame and bitterness of a wrecked ambition. I mean, nobody can top the Victorians for drama. Now, you know, some people actually wound up staying on the island for one reason or another, and they weren't always sick. You know, some of them were, you know, either ill, they were, but sometimes they had to wait until American relatives could be located or could travel there. Because sometimes, you know, if somebody was like in Idaho or something, it took days to get to New York, at least 4 and possibly 5. So they had to stay there until somebody could claim them, basically. And in a way, this is what happened to Agnes, because when she got on the boat from Ellis Island, she landed at Battery Park. As she walked out of the park across State Street to what is now the Church of Elizabeth Bailey Seton, but at the time was considered something like a home for Irish immigrant girls. And she stayed there that day until Daniel came and met her, whether they prearranged this meeting place, because he would certainly know where it was. And or, you know, somebody just told her, well, just go over there and they'll find you. It's hard to say, but I have a feeling it was probably prearranged. But other people wound up having to stay on the island. Now, while they were on the island, all of their expenses, their bedding, the sanitary facilities, the food, everything was all provided for free. It was all at the expense of the American taxpayer. And this is in the old Ellis Island, the dining room. And this is a typical menu from a little bit later. For dinner, they have mock turtle soup, ragu of mutton, vegetables, and boiled potatoes with Liberty pudding, which I don't know what that is, and bread and butter. And it says, milk served to all women and children. And there was a really sort of method to this because they were trying to swiftly Americanize these people by serving them the kind of meals that the typical American household would normally have on their table. So they were like experiencing things like coffee for the first time, which was more rare in Europe. And they had all saying really exotic things like ice cream and bananas. So it was quite an experience for these people. Okay, now here's a very big question. People always ask this: was my immigrant ancestor's name changed at Ellis Island? That is like one of the biggest urban myths out there. And I mean, I've read at least a dozen articles about this over the years, debunking this, and all all these articles. And said basically U.S. inspectors used the information provided by the shipping company, which got its information from the immigrants themselves. So that's basically how it worked. It also had another, thing to stopgap to make sure everything was right, because many of these inspectors were originally foreign born. They were immigrants themselves. And as they got Americanized and they applied to the civil service, they got a job as immigration inspectors, and being bilingual, they were able to get everybody through. And as a further hedge against possible misnaming, they had a lot of volunteers who were permitted on the island, and major groups like the Knights of Columbus would come aboard, the Hebrew Aid Society would come on board, and these people would help at every single turn to get these immigrants through. Now, as I said, not making cut, how many were deported? So basically 2% or 120,000 people didn't make it. So basically, it really went pretty well. And as for changing the names, there was absolutely no policy ever to change anyone's names. Although there was a sort of an amusing story that they had a man named Frank Woodhull, who, to the chagrin of the inspectors, admitted that his name was really Mary Wilson, and she had been living as a man for some 12 years. And and they permitted Frank/Mary to enter the United States, but they had to record her birth name, Mary Wilson. So in a way, it's almost sort of brings to mind some of these laws in the last couple of years about bathroom use, that you use the bathroom on your birth certificate, no matter what. So it's sort of interesting. Now, this family here in the picture, the DiCarlo family, they had an interesting thing. Mrs. DiCarlo was widowed when her husband died in a mine disaster in West Virginia, and they had like 5 or 6 kids, and they were allowed to, by the coal company, they requested repatriation back to Europe, and they were sent back. But a year later, she came back again, and she was taken in hand by a group called the Saint Raphael Society on Charlton Street, which the article described as the West Village, but it's really not. But that's a little insider New York stuff. But I'm not going to quibble. And anyway, when they went through this time, they had to have someone take care of them because one of the children appeared to be ill. And so they took them, instead of keeping them on the island, they were permitted to take them to Charlton Street, and they were able to keep them there because the big delay was that these children had been born in the United States and had to do inquiries to actually verify that they were in fact Americans. And there was a happy ending to this. Eventually, they concluded that it was, and actually the youngest, they said that when you count the months, and everything between, conception, birth, and when their father died, that there was absolutely no other way that he could not have been the father. So anyway, it actually turned out all for the good. Now, like any other government agency, the Bureau of Immigration Services had to report to Congress. And they actually took these pictures of immigrants for the record. And this was a Dutch woman on the left and a trio of Cossacks from Russia on the right. And so these were part of their, yearly reports to Congress because they had to justify their budget. And they had quite a few of them too, because I think in 1907 they literally processed 1 million people. So they definitely wanted to keep the funding going. And so anyway, we passed. What do we do now? so once they got through the physical, mental exam, the interrogations, everything was over. They had to go back downstairs, find their luggage, and they had to exchange their currency because they didn't care. They just cared that you had money. They didn't care if it was foreign money. They actually had a money exchange right there. And they also had a railroad ticket office. So you could actually buy a ticket. Now, of course, that must have been an experience getting off the boat from the island, being dumped onto Battery Park and trying to take the elevated train line to get to a station like Pennsylvania or Grand Central that will actually take you where you could actually use your rail ticket. So that was in fact, actually, this gives you the whole reason of why the Ellis Island was relocated onto an island immigration, because in the old Castle Garden days, I mean, they literally opened up onto Battery Park, and these poor immigrants would literally be bum rushed by all of these people who meant them no good. And one of the typical scams of the period was they called them runners. These were young men who were hired by boarding houses in the Lower East Side, like around Eldridge Street, which was basically about a mile or so away. And they would target a good-sized immigrant family trying to orient themselves, and they would grab a piece of luggage and take off. There were even cases where sometimes the youngest child was taken from the party, and these people were forced to follow them through all of these strange streets till they got to the rooming house, and they were charged this exorbitant amount of money to stay there overnight because they didn't know where they were. They literally didn't. So the island was supposed to, like I said, Americanize them, give them some tips how to navigate and everything, give them space so that things like that wouldn't happen. And so now it was time to say goodbye. These lucky people, they're waiting for the ferry to take them to the mainland. And here they are. They're going to start new lives here in America. But, today you can actually visit the Great Hall has been restored. That you can see parts of the buildings have been restored. This is a typical dormitory that's been restored. Although most of it, one of their plans is to actually restore the hospital. And you saw that building earlier. And, it takes fundraising, it takes a budget from Congress, and they hope to be able to do that. Right now, you can actually take what they call a hard hat tour of parts of the island that are not reconstructed, and they'll tell you what what they were for, what they planned to do with them in the future. And so it's really sort of an interesting experience. And this is the end. Here's an immigrant family looking at the skyline of Manhattan, just waiting for the boat to make it all happen. So thank you for sharing this with me. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask me. And thanks again.
Okay. I have a couple of questions, but thank you so much. I love this. And I think these people were so courageous. Now, if all the record keeping at Ellis Island began around 1890, what about the immigrants who came before? For example, I know my 2 times great-grandparents came. Their first children were born 1857 here.
Yeah.
So where might I find records on them?
Okay, that's a good question, Annie. Pretty much most of the 19th century passenger lists are on Ancestry Library Edition, or if you have your own Ancestry.com subscription, and you can actually target it on the right side of the search screen. They have the different categories, and you could see like passenger and immigration, and so you could just like really narrow the search. And one
But there
thing you
wasn't really governmental
no,
over.
because like I said before, before the feds took over in 1890, it was really largely a local affair. I mean, like for instance, the United States government required foreigners to have passports in 1825. Philadelphia started in 1787.
Yeah. Oh, okay. And one other thing, I had great-grandparents who came from Germany. They would travel back by boat, sometimes to have a child and then come back. Were they
Yeah.
held to, and now I'm not sure if they were naturalized, but were they held to a similar set of rules?
Well, it depended. If they traveled by steerage, chances are, but they probably had some sort of documentations, and they had all these different things. Like, for instance, somebody I knew in Brooklyn, I found his great grandfather's record, and he was a seaman who traveled between Italy and the United States, and he would go back and forth. And the record said he was a non-immigrant alien. So eventually he did become an immigrant and actually did come to the United States. But before that, so they had all of these sort of strange little things.
Quirks.
Yeah.
As far as the names, I know on the census, they destroyed names. Oh my
Oh
God.
yeah, and that was
I don't
easy
know
to
about
do.
the passenger lists. I don't remember if they were, if
Yeah.
it was a passenger list, but
Yeah, it's really, really hard, and it wasn't limited to immigrants because the old spelling of my family name 200 years ago was Willcockson. I mean,
oh
we
my goodness.
literally chopped it in half,
Yeah.
starting in 1800 on. So, and I remember these enumerators, I mean, and my mother was an enumerator in 1960. She had this big ledger and she would write all this hand by hand. And
Right.
so, you
Oh
know,
yeah.
yeah. And sometimes whatever somebody told you, you just had to write down what you thought they said.
Said, yeah. And finally, I have to know if Agnes's marriage was arranged.
You know, I tend to think that like I said, I really think Father Henry, because I've seen
Put it
him
together.
elsewhere. Yeah, that you know he had regular correspondence. If you said you wanted a wife, he would just write back to the old country and see what could be arranged. And so it's sort of interesting.
They were brave people.
Yeah, but they weren't very young. They were he was 35 and she was 34, but the Irish
Well, that
tended to
was
marry late.
later.
Yeah.
Mm.
Okay, anyone else? Okay, any comments, any questions? Yeah, I'm here.
Thank you.
Okay,
Say,
welcome.
Tom, can you hear me? Did I do it right?
Yes, Gail.
I really appreciated you adding your family history into this presentation. It really made it more real. So thank you. I enjoyed it very much. Excellent presentation.
All right, thank you. Because, you know, whenever possible, I always bring the family into the act.
Well, it was very good.
All right, thanks.
I just want to step in here. My name is Elaine. I work with Tom. If you are interested, Tom is actually conducting two more presentations next week. One on Monday at 11 o'clock, and it's about how to date old photographs. You may be interested in that if you have some genealogy projects going. But the second one is going to be held on July 2nd, again at 11 o'clock, I believe. And it's all about how the American colonies became the United States.
Oh,
And
nice.
so you may be interested and just have to register there on our website.
Okay, and that one is perfect for the 4th of July.
Oh, keep them coming. I love them.
Oh yeah, you know, I'm going through my whole repertoire.
I don't know how you do all this. Oh my heavens, all this information. I'd love to crawl in your head sometimes.
I know many people have said that.
Yeah.
You know, so one of my best friends said I have to give my brain to science,
Yep.
but I'm still using it now. So tough luck.
Okay, that's good. We're to our benefit.
Okay,
Thank
thanks.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
See
Bye-bye.
you next week.
Okay.